Tell us about this book because it's so complex. It's ridiculously amazing.
Yeah, well, um, The Whole Earth is a Garden of Monsters is a book of poems uh, that has two stories with two different characters that are braided. The structure of the book, I like to think of the structure of the book not as a set of mirrors, which it is, but more of a braid, you know. Um, One of the characters is an existing biographical character, Hieronymus Bosch, El Bosco in Spanish, this Renaissance painter from the Netherlands that famously made the Garden of Early Delights I have here.
Mm.
And the other one is a person that I invented. His name starts being Juan Coyoc, then his name is Juan Domínguez. Um, Now, what I say in the note at the very beginning of the book is that we know the work of Hieronymus Bosch or Hieronymus Van Aken, which was his name first, and but we don't know almost anything about his life.
Mm.
So even though he's a real character, he's largely imaginary. Now, Juan Coyoc, which is the character that I invented, is imaginary, but a lot of the things that I say that happened to him have happened to somebody. This is a result of reading biographies, interviews, and of conversations with friends and some of my students about the passing of their families through the desert to get to the United States. So even though Juan Coyoc is an imaginary character, it's largely real. So the book is we have a biographical character that is very much imaginary and an imaginary character that is very much real. And the biographies of these two characters, even though one is a 16th century European man and the other one is a 21st century Latin American man, they have a lot in common.
Mm.
There are a lot of echoes in between their poems and their biographies. A lot of the poems have the same titles, and we jump from one reality to another. I purposely create some confusion in the reader, so the reader doesn't know is this the life of this one or the other one? But that confusion is part of the thing because I want all of my readers to realize that one person has the same dignity that any other person,
Mm.
that a very important European artist of the 16th century and an almost anonymous man of the 21st century have the same humanity.
Uh, is
And
that the why? Because I was continue reading, I was like, but why? Because this guy is so obscure. Like, why him? Why the painter, this European painter?
well, Hieronymus Bosch has always, since I was an adolescent or maybe before, obsessed me.
Mm.
And I have the same question. The question was, why? Why this guy is painting these things?
Mhm.
These things that are so mysterious and at the same time so beautiful. If we think about the Garden of Earthly Delights, which is a very complex triptych, you know, with the creation, then the Garden of Early Delights, which is all of the temptations in the paradise, and then the last part of the triptych that seems like to be hell
Mhm.
or punishment. When I saw that and I realized that that painting is contemporary of the Mona Lisa, for example,
Mhm.
I was thinking like that is not the same Renaissance. That is not the same kind of experimentation. What is going on with this particular painter that is a surrealist, centuries before surrealism?
Mhm.
Um, so for me, it has been evident that Hieronymus Bosch wanted to express things that were beyond the regular things that a painter wants to express. He was existentially worried about something. You know, it's his paintings are worried with transcendence itself. You know, with judgment and all of this. And I knew that I wanted to write a book about him.
Mhm.
But then when I started writing the book, I wanted to pull him to our reality. I wanted to make him relevant for us. And first, I thought that I was going to write a book in which Juan Domínguez was not going to be an immigrant. He was going to be a boring man in an office, maybe something like an accountant in an office with no windows, that he was all day looking at his screen and working on Excel sheets and has no family life, no friends, like very gray man that has no will to do anything exciting. But when he fell asleep, he
Mm,
had all of this uh, images in his head about the Hieronymus Bosch's paintings.
mhm,
I thought that that was going to be my book. And then when I started writing, the book wrote itself in
mhm,
a completely different way. Um, I realized that I needed Juan Domínguez. I realized that I needed a character that changed its name, just like Hieronymus Bosch changed his name. I realized that the changing of name had to come after a fire, just like Hieronymus Bosch changed his name after a fire. And then there was one character that I didn't know, that I didn't plan. This happened while I was writing, which was Antonio,
mhm,
the little brother, because there is Saint Anthony the Great in one hand, which is in for Hieronymus Bosch is a motif to write about this saint that was in the desert and that, according to the tradition, fought with his hands demons and temptations. And I needed a saint, and the only way to have it a saint was for him to be a kid,
mm,
and not only a kid, but a kid that is mute.
mm,
Um, Antonio has the age of my daughter right now, 7 years old.
yeah.
And then Antonio confronts the demons, which in that part of the book are the demons of narcos and things like that. So that violence. So there are a lot of parallels between the two lives. And I think that the work of Hieronymus Bosch has all of the imagery and the mysteries and the light and the obscurity too that can make us think about our current situation. It is not that far from us.
Um, wow. Okay. When when you're talking, I'm thinking about so many things. I thought it was interesting that we you didn't have the images of the painter's work in the text. And I'm wondering why, because that absence, right? And I feel like it was purposeful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I do not put the images on the text um, because I wanted the reader to go and look.
Mm,
There is a lot of research in
yeah.
my text. I talk about historical things. A lot of epigraphs are from newspapers, from news articles, or from um, eh, research about the Middle Age, about the St. Anthony's fire, which is a medieval disease, this kind of stuff. But I wanted the poems to be able to be understood independently,
Hmm.
to not depend of the paintings. However, I do make clear references to which part of the painting even. It's like it is the left panel, it is the central panel, it is this, and I mention and I describe. So I know that if the reader just does the research, goes to the internet and finds these images, which are very easy to find, then there is a complicity between us.
Yeah. You're making the reader participate. I think about Toni
Yes.
Morrison is always urging the reader to read The Invisible Ink, to participate. This is your book as well.
Yes. And then when I mention one detail of the painting,
Mhm.
the reader is not going to have other choice but to look at the whole painting. And the reader is going to see more things that are there.
Mhm.
Because if I refer in general terms to one painting, um, I believe that I am also in danger of oversimplifying something.
Mhm.
Whereas when I talk about this particular character, that is it, like when I talk about the owl, and I say in the middle of this, there is one owl, and the owl is the only one that is looking straight at us. And then when the reader goes and looks for the painting, in order to prove that what I'm saying is true, he's going to have to look at the eyes of everybody else in the painting and the owl just to make sure that it's true that the owl is the only one looking back at us. And that time to go to look, to pay attention to the painting, which I'm forcing the reader to do, is another form of reading the book.
Mm. Wow, it's very meta. It's art, talking about art, talking about art, talking about art.
Yes,
I
yes.
think it's really like paramount and very important and really like emphasizing the power and importance of reading and reading between the texts and reading
Mhm.
like seeing the relationship between these texts and art in our lives. It's almost like you're teaching us to read on many different levels and genres.
That's the idea. I want my reader to slow down
Mm,
and to take the time to appreciate that work of art and the one that is reading too.
mhm,
Um, and then to give a step back and say, well, whether it's painting or the poems about Juan Domínguez or the poems about Hieronymus Bosch, whether it's in English or in Spanish, this is about the human condition.
mm.
This is about what we are. This is about love and life and death and suffering and hope and violence and childhood. This is about and beauty. Um, it is, I know it is in many moments a very painful book,
Yeah.
you
Did-
know.
I was like, "Ooh, that stung."
Yes, yes, when for me, I was not expecting this, I didn't plan this, but there is a moment in which Antonio raises his hand
Mhm,
when the narcos are recruiting them and they say, well, here I see two people, two kinds of people. The ones who are coming with us or the ones who are going to die. Who here wants to die?
mm,
And the mute 7-year-old raises his hand.
mm,
And the brother says, put your hand down. And the kid, straight looking at the eyes of his brother, shakes his head no and keeps the hand up. And then the train starts moving again and they go. But that moment when this 7-year-old kid raises his hand after somebody asks, who wants to die, was a moment that was very painful for me to write,
mm.
but it was necessary for it to be there. Um, so I know that it can be um, a somber book,
Yeah,
just like its title,
yeah,
you know. Um, but even though it's full of monsters, it's still a garden.
yeah,
So I think that the nature of the world is the nature of a garden. Now it is full
yeah.
of monsters.
It when I read this book and when I hear you talking, it feels that you're like really I don't want to say pushing against the genre, but you're really opening up like what a poem can be. Like
Yes.
just with just in terms of like you talking about it being braided, about characters. And I really like how you're kind of fragmenting that idea. Can you talk a little bit
Yes.
about that?
I am interested for this book in particular. I am very interested in impurity.
Mm,
I do not want my poems to be only poems. This tells a story.
mhm.
It is a narrative. It reads almost like a novella. There are two stories and they are braided, and the climax of one story coincides with the climax of the other one. Like the tone of the two stories goes to the same arc, even though the two characters never know each other.
Yeah.
Only we, the readers, realize the how alike they are, but they never know of each other. They have centuries of distance.
Mhm.
Only we know that they are an echo of each other because we have the privilege of reading one story right after the other. But the world had waited 400 or 500 years in between those stories. And that is because our notion of what a poem is that is so exclusive, like a poem is in verse and does these things, is is a very novel uh, notion. The Iliad and the Odyssey
Mhm.
were not only poetry, they were poetry and they were narrative and they were the books of the law and they were the history of the people and they were the genealogy and the cosmogony. Like everything was in there.
Mhm.
And later we developed all of the literary genres and all of these different forms of understanding and making poetry. But I do not mind going back
Mhm.
and giving to poetry whatever power it needs to have in order to convey what I needed to convey. I couldn't have expressed everything that I wanted to express in this book being a purist.
Mhm.
In other moments of my poetry, in prior books, I have written much more traditional poems.
Mhm.
You know, my last book is also a book about immigration and with a great deal of poems about my daughter and about fatherhood. Um, and those are more lyrical, um, more traditional poems, even though I never rhyme and things like that. But they are they're testimonial, very sentimental, very dear to me poems. But this time I felt like I needed to tell a story.
Mhm.
And more than one story, it is two stories because really what I'm trying to talk is about the story of humankind.
Mhm.
And I use two examples to show how alike we are from one another.
Mhm. I'm okay. I've been reading really good poetry, and so I read there's a Filipino writer whose poem is coming out really soon, Joseph Olahari. There's Camille Dungy, who I interviewed, and you. And these are three books I read in the last month. And I really think like after reading their books and being in conversation with them, I really think what we are going through right now is that I've I love how poets are at the forefront of that. They're speaking about that, even though these books just publish, right? They're at the forefront of our imagination of how we're feeling and how we're thinking. And I think it's so beautiful. And I think right now with the brevity of poetry, they can get those points and feelings across. And I just, it's I I'm in awe like of like what poets are constantly doing and how they can do that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that poetry does, and it is not something that that poets do consciously.
Mhm.
I don't think that any poet sits down and says, what am I going to say about the current situation of the world?
Yeah.
And that is because poetry is not written from knowledge,
Mm,
but from intuition.
mm,
There is a great deal of knowledge in it, but really the driving force of poetry is not knowing instead of knowing.
mhm,
The poet doesn't know, but has intuitions, has guesses, has hopefully epiphanies.
mhm,
And when the epiphany happens, like many times it happens during the writing of this book, you come up with something that is looks like a poem, and that later you realize that talks about something that is really important. But it was not intentional. I didn't sit down with this book in my head. I sat down with two very alike melodies. I had a melody for Juan Coyoc and a melody for Hieronymus Bosch, and I had some idea of what I wanted to say, but then I was chasing a rhythm. I was chasing music. Um, and then when things started being on the page or on the screen, then I realized what I was doing, and then I had some degree of consciousness.
mhm,
Um, but I think that what is happening with poetry now is what has always happened with poetry. It's like um, poets put themselves in in a position where they foresee something
Mhm.
without getting away from everybody else.
Mm.
The poet is not above the crowd or farther from the crowd, it is in the middle of them, but has the ability of singing everybody's orphanhood,
Mm.
of singing everybody's pain, and to see maybe some sort of to be able to articulate with words
Mm.
the silence of everybody.
When you're talking and it just makes me think that, especially when you're talking about your book and how you felt like it right itself, it makes me feel that like it's almost like a spiritual practice.
Yes,
Yeah.
I believe in poetry as a spiritual practice. I believe that the poems are the testimony
Mm.
of a spiritual search.
Mm.
Um, I don't think some poets believe in poetry as the act of experimenting with language. I do not.
Mm.
I think that the experimentation with language, experimentation with words, is the result of an spiritual search, is
Mm.
a result of a philosophical search. We are in search of meaning. We are in search of words. We are constantly trying to translate our silences into words. And um, the poet, in the way I conceive the poet quiets himself, yeah, as a sort of a spiritual decantation. We let ourselves inside set in. Then at some point, if it happens, we receive a form of grace. We receive an epiphany. And the poem is the testimony of that encounter. The poem is the way that we leave testimony of something that was beyond us.
Mm.
You
Well,
know,
this is, oh my God. I feel like